April 4th in the year of our Lord 1873 was the day that Catherine Beatrice Westbrook ceased to be a girl and became something considerably more complicated. She did not know this yet. What she knew, as she descended the staircase of her father's London townhouse in a gown of pale rose silk, was that she was 18 years old, and that the day promised the kind of spring afternoon where light transforms ordinary things into something approaching beauty. The townhouse, which had always felt somewhat imposing to her, her father's newly acquired symbol of commercial success, seemed almost welcoming in that particular quality of illumination. Her father waited in the drawing room with her mother and her companion, Elizabeth. James Westbrook was a man whose prosperity manifested in the particular kind of contentment visible in the set of his shoulders and the frequency with which he consulted his pocket watch, as though measuring the value of each moment in minutes and financial units. Her mother, Anne, occupied a chair with the careful posture of a woman who had learned, through years of marriage to a merchant, that bearing mattered considerably more than actual emotion. 18 years old, her father announced, as Catherine entered the room. My daughter has reached the age of maturity. This is, without question, the most significant birthday of her life. By evening, everything will be different. Catherine felt something in her chest tighten, not unpleasantly, but with the quality of anticipation that suggests the world is about to tilt in some unexpected direction. Has she been informed? Her mother asked, her voice carrying the careful neutrality that characterized most of her interactions with her daughter. She has not, her father replied, and I intend for the revelation to come from myself, as is appropriate. Catherine, sit. There is something that requires discussion. Catherine settled into the chair across from her father, conscious of Elizabeth's presence beside her, present but silent, as companions were trained to be. The afternoon light caught in Catherine's chestnut hair, creating the impression of subtle auburn highlights that appeared and disappeared as she moved. Your mother and I have received an offer, her father continued, extracting a letter from his waistcoat pocket, with the kind of ceremony suggesting the paper itself was valuable, an offer of considerable significance. An offer that frankly exceeds the circumstances of our family by a margin substantial enough that I spent 3 days attempting to determine whether the offer was genuine or whether some elaborate deception was occurring. Catherine's hands, which she had been attempting to keep still in her lap, betrayed her by clasping together. The Duke of Creston, her father said, and he pronounced the title with the kind of reverence typically reserved for royalty, has requested that you become his wife. For approximately 3 seconds, Catherine could not determine whether she had properly understood the words that her father had spoken. The Duke of Creston, a title she recognized from social context, but could not directly associate with any specific individual. His Grace has made inquiries regarding your age, your education, your character, her father continued, and he is determined that he would like to formalize his desire to marry you by the end of this week. A special license has been obtained. The ceremony will occur on April 11th. I do not know him, Catherine said finally, and the words came out not as objection, but as simple statement of fact. No, her father agreed, you do not. But you will discover him, as wives discover husbands. And more importantly, the Duke of Creston is a man of considerable wealth and considerable title. Your marriage to him will elevate this entire family into circumstances of genuine aristocratic connection. Your children will be of the highest social standing. You will become a duchess. Catherine's mother made a small sound that might have been either approval or anxiety, depending on the observer's interpretation. He is not a young man, her father continued, as though this was inconvenient detail that required honest acknowledgement. He is approximately 32 years of age. He is by all accounts a man of education and refinement, and he has indicated that he is willing to provide your family with a settlement of extraordinary generosity, provided that you consent to the marriage. Has he indicated why he wishes to marry someone he has never encountered? Catherine asked. The question came not from particular wisdom, but from genuine confusion. His motivations are his own, her father replied. What matters is the opportunity. You have been given opportunity that women in circumstances considerably superior to yours would envy. You will accept it. It was not precisely a question. April 10th, one day before the wedding, Catherine arrived at Creston House in a carriage provided by the Duke himself, an extraordinary gesture, suggesting that her family's acceptance of the marriage was foregone conclusion rather than subject requiring negotiation. The estate was not what she had anticipated. She had imagined something approaching a palace, all ostentatious displays of wealth and ancient aristocratic superiority. Instead, what she encountered was something considerably more subtle and considerably more beautiful. The manor house possessed the kind of architecture suggesting it had been perfected over centuries rather than constructed all at once. Massive, yes, but somehow integrated into the landscape as though it had grown from the earth rather than been imposed upon it. A woman of severe appearance met Catherine in the entry hall. The Dowager Duchess, she was informed, Margaret Elliot Wellington. The Dowager was tall, with steel-grey hair arranged with military precision, and eyes that suggested she was observing Catherine with the kind of attention typically reserved for inventory assessment. "You are younger than I anticipated," the Dowager said, and there was no warmth in the observation, "and considerably less aristocratic in bearing, though I suppose this is inevitable given your origins." Catherine, who had been trained since childhood to maintain composure when confronted with criticism, simply inclined her head. "I am grateful for your patience as I adjust to circumstances of such considerable difference from my previous experience." Something flickered across the Dowager's face, not quite approval but perhaps recognition that Catherine was not entirely unprepared for this world. "Your chamber is on the second floor," the Dowager continued. "You will be escorted there by Miss Harrows. You will rest. The wedding occurs tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. You will be dressed and ready by 8 o'clock. You will not make demands upon the household staff. You will maintain quiet comportment. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Grace," Catherine replied. It was only as she ascended the staircase toward her chamber that Catherine permitted herself genuine reaction to the reality of her circumstances. Her hands trembled as she gripped the mahogany banister. In less than 24 hours, she would become wife to a man she had never met. A duke. A woman of considerable social standing. A person entirely transformed. The chamber assigned to her was beautiful, in the way that aristocratic beauty always is. Furniture that represented wealth without requiring constant attention. Windows overlooking gardens that seemed to extend indefinitely into the countryside. Elizabeth unpacked her wedding gown with careful attention, laying it across the bed as though it were artifact rather than garment. "You will manage," Elizabeth said quietly, in the way that companions speak when they are attempting to communicate genuine conviction. "You are capable of managing more than you realize." Catherine did not respond. Instead, she moved to the window and observed the grounds below. Everything was precisely in order. Everything was arranged. Everything was prepared for tomorrow. Everything except Catherine herself. April 11th, 1873. The ceremony occurred with the kind of efficiency suggesting it had been performed numerous times before, though the actual words, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," seemed to carry considerably more weight than the speed of their delivery suggested they should. Henry Wellington, Duke of Creston, was pale, not simply fair-complexioned in the manner of aristocrats who avoided sun, but pale in a way that suggested fundamental absence of vitality. Catherine had encountered him for the first time at the altar, and what struck her immediately was not his appearance, though his appearance was striking in its way, but the quality of effort that every single movement seemed to require. He was taller than she had anticipated, thin, but the thinness was not fashionable thinness. It was the thinness of someone whose body had been systematically stripped of unnecessary matter. His eyes were extraordinary, deep brown, almost black, and they were observing Catherine with an intensity that suggested he was cataloguing every detail of her appearance. "You are younger than I anticipated," he said quietly, as they began the carriage journey from the church toward the estate. "Your Grace," Catherine replied, "I have discovered that this observation appears to be universal." He made a sound that might have been laughter, or might simply have been cough. "You are not entirely unintelligent. That is unexpected relief." The wedding breakfast occurred with Catherine sitting at substantial distance from her new husband, observing him across table as he appeared to make considerable effort to engage in conversation with family and assembled guests. His breathing, she noticed, seemed to require deliberate attention. When he reached for wineglass, his hand trembled slightly. By evening, Catherine was alone in the Duke's chamber, which was now, she understood, also her chamber. She wore a white nightgown that had been selected by her mother with all the solemnity of ritual. The room was lit by candles. Everything was prepared for what would occur. When Henry entered, he was moving very slowly, and Catherine understood with sudden clarity that moving slowly was not choice, but necessity. He wore a dressing gown, and even in darkness she could perceive the prominence of bone beneath fabric. "I require that we discuss something prior to consummation of this marriage," he said, and he sat on the edge of the bed, as though merely sitting required considerable energy allocation. "You have married a man who is dying." Catherine made attempt to formulate response and discovered she possessed none. "I am not being melodramatic," he continued quietly. "I am stating fact. I suffer from consumption. The disease has progressed to stage where recovery is not possible. I will be dead within 6 to 8 months, possibly sooner, possibly, with good management of pain and proper care, slightly longer. But death is not possibility. Death is eventuality. Why would you marry me if—" Catherine began, and then stopped, because she could not determine how to complete the question. "Because," Henry replied, "I am dying, and I have concluded that dying alone is considerably worse than dying in company. And because a woman of your age and capability deserves more than to spend her life as ornament in household governed by my mother. Because perhaps if I marry, my death will create circumstances that provide you with options and independence that you would otherwise never possess. Because marrying you was act of genuine compassion toward you rather than toward myself." He paused, and Catherine could observe him breathing, each breath appearing to require conscious effort. "But more than that," he continued, "I have decided that if I must die in next several months, I would prefer to spend those months with someone who will see me genuinely rather than seeing only the Duke, and I have hope that perhaps you might consider being that person." Catherine understood in that moment that her life had changed in ways that extended far beyond simply acquiring title or elevation of social position. April 12th through April 16th. 5 days during which Catherine discovered that marriage to dying man was considerably more complicated than simple physical consummation. The first morning, Henry did not appear for breakfast. Catherine descended to the dining room expecting to encounter him, and instead encountered the Dowager Duchess, who was consuming toast with the kind of methodical attention suggesting eating was task rather than pleasure. "He experiences worse mornings," the Dowager said without preamble. "Some days he remains in his chamber until midday. You will learn to accommodate this reality." "Is there nothing that can be done?" Catherine asked. "No medical—" "Doctor, Ashby has done everything that medicine permits," the Dowager interrupted. "The disease is beyond modern medicine's capacity to address. What remains is management of pain and comfort, nothing more. You would be wise to accept this reality rather than wasting energy on denial." Henry appeared in the drawing room that afternoon, dressed impeccably in dark coat and waistcoat, though Catherine could observe that the clothing hung on him with considerably more space than should exist between fabric and body. He carried himself with aristocratic precision that suggested his body was force of will rather than physical strength. "I apologize for absence from breakfast," he said, his formality suggesting he had rehearsed the words. "I experience certain complications in mornings that require solitude and time." "You need not apologize," Catherine replied. "I am endeavoring to understand the rhythms of this household and to adjust my expectations accordingly." "Your expectations regarding what?" Henry asked. Catherine considered answer carefully. "Regarding everything. Regarding you. Regarding marriage. Regarding my role in all of this." Henry studied her with expression suggesting she had said something unexpected. "You are remarkably honest for someone in your circumstances." "My circumstances are sufficiently unusual that dishonesty seems to serve no purpose," Catherine replied. Over subsequent days, a rhythm began to establish itself. Henry would appear for luncheon on days when he felt adequate strength. He would take afternoon tea in the drawing room. Evenings he would retreat to library, and Catherine would read while he managed documents and correspondence. They occupied same space without requirement for constant conversation. On evening of April 16th, Henry requested that Catherine join him in study. When she entered, she discovered him examining account books, with expressions suggesting they required considerable concentration. "I require your assistance with something of moderate importance," he said. "The household accounts are in considerably disordered state, due to my inability to attend to them personally. Dr. Ashby informs me that I should not exert myself with business matters, but business matters do not cease existing simply because one becomes ill." "I can attempt to assist," Catherine offered cautiously. "Can you manage numerical calculations?" Henry asked. "My father ensured I possessed education sufficient to understand basic mathematics and accounting," Catherine confirmed. "He believed women who manage households must be capable of managing finances." Henry's expression shifted. "Then I have married woman who is considerably less useless than typically expected. This is pleasant surprise." By April 18th, Catherine had begun reviewing household accounts. identifying discrepancies and presenting findings to Henry in afternoon hours when he possessed adequate energy. She discovered that the estate was profitable, but considerably less well managed than it could be. She discovered that careful attention to detail could produce efficiency that benefited everyone. She also discovered that Henry observed her with intensity that suggested he was reassessing his understanding of what marriage to her might become. April 20th. Catherine was preparing for evening when Elizabeth brought message that Dr. Ashby had arrived and was requesting audience with both Catherine and the Duke in Henry's private study. This was first occasion that Catherine encountered the family physician. Dr. William Ashby was man of approximately 55 years, with appearance suggesting that years had been spent in close study of medical texts and human suffering. His eyes were kind, but kindness was tempered by awareness of things that could not be prevented. "I have been asked to provide your Grace with thorough understanding of your Grace's condition," Dr. Ashby said, with the careful formality of physician speaking to person of rank. "I believe this information is necessary for you to make informed decisions regarding your situation." He set down his medical bag, with the kind of deliberate care suggesting he was preparing to deliver information of some significance. "His Grace is suffering from consumption of the lungs," he continued. "The disease has progressed to advanced stage, where the lungs are substantially compromised. The disease is invariably fatal. There is no treatment capable of arresting disease progression. There is no treatment capable of reversing damage already done." Catherine felt her hands go cold. "I estimate that His Grace has between 5 and 7 months of life remaining," Dr. Ashby continued. "This estimation assumes good care, minimal exertion, and careful management of pain. The disease is progressive. Each week capacity will diminish. Breathing will become increasingly difficult. Pain will increase. Eventually, the body will cease to function adequately to maintain life." "Is there nothing—" Catherine began. "Nothing," Dr. Ashby confirmed. "There is nothing that can be done except to provide comfort and manage decline. I will visit weekly to assess status and adjust medications. I will provide pain management as situation deteriorates. But I cannot arrest the disease, no one can." He turned to Henry, who had been sitting silently throughout this exposition. "Your Grace was aware of this prognosis when you married. Your wife was not. I believe transparency is appropriate." Henry nodded slightly. "There is one matter that requires discussion," Dr. Ashby continued, and his expression suggested this was a particularly delicate topic, regarding conjugal relations. "Given your Grace's condition, physical exertion of that nature will place considerable strain on already compromised breathing and circulation. I must recommend that such relations be limited to occasions when your Grace feels adequate strength and that they occur with considerable care regarding exertion." Catherine felt her face go hot. Whether from embarrassment or shock, she could not determine. After Dr. Ashby departed, Henry remained seated in his study, while Catherine stood by window, attempting to process information that had fundamentally altered her understanding of her circumstances. "I have 5 to 7 months, Henry said finally, his voice very quiet, perhaps less. "It depends on numerous factors. This is reality that I have been living with for 2 years. This is reality I chose not to burden you with until you were my wife, because I knew you would otherwise refuse me." Catherine turned to face him. "You deceived me." "Yes," Henry agreed, "I deceived you. I did so deliberately and with a forethought. I will not apologize for it, because doing so would suggest that I regret my action, but I will acknowledge that I made conscious choice to conceal information from you." "Why?" Catherine asked, and the word came out not as accusation, but as genuine question. "Because 5 to 7 months is time enough to experience something genuine," Henry replied. "It is not adequate time to live entire life, but it is adequate time to have authentic marriage, to have authentic partnership, to experience being known by another person, completely." He looked at her directly, and in his expression Catherine perceived something that transcended dying man's desperation. "I am dying," he said, "and I am aware that I am dying. And I have concluded that dying in isolation is considerably worse than dying in company. If marriage to me gives you circumstances of independence and security, then my death will have served purpose. But if marriage to me also provides me with possibility of experiencing genuine partnership in final months of my life, that is outcome I do not deserve but have nonetheless received." Catherine sat down heavily in the chair opposite him. "You have given me profound gift by marrying me without full information regarding what gift entails," Henry continued. Now you have full information. Now you can determine whether you wish to remain in this marriage or whether you wish to terminate it. Dr. Ashby has informed me that unconsummated marriage can be dissolved. You have option of choosing differently. Catherine understood as she sat in that study with dying man who had married her under false premises that she possessed possibility of refusing this situation, that she could demand dissolution, that she could return to her father and demand that he reverse arrangements that he had created. Instead, she found herself saying, "How do I assist you? How do I manage this situation in a way that provides you with what you have requested?" And in the silence that followed, she understood that she had made choice that would define the remainder of her life. April 22nd, 1873. Henry did not appear for luncheon. Catherine discovered this when she descended to the dining room and found only the Dowager Duchess seated at the table, consuming fish with methodical precision that suggested her thoughts were occupied elsewhere. "His Grace is experiencing fever," the Dowager said without preamble. "This is not uncommon. The disease produces periodic fevers of considerable intensity. They typically persist for several days before remitting. You may occupy yourself as you choose until he is capable of resuming normal functions." Catherine did not respond immediately. Instead, she found herself rising from the table and moving toward the staircase that led to Henry's chambers. The Dowager made no attempt to prevent her. She found him in bed, though it was merely midday. The chamber was dark, curtains drawn against spring light, and the air possessed the particular quality of stillness that exists in sick rooms, as though the air itself had stilled in respect for the illness. Henry was conscious, but clearly removed from full presence in the world. His skin possessed feverish flush, and when Catherine approached, she could observe that his breathing was more labored than usual. "Catherine," he said, and her name in his voice carried quality of uncertainty, as though he was not entirely certain she was actually present. "You should not be here. Fever may be contagious to those without immunity." "I am not concerned," Catherine replied, and she found herself moving to the window and opening curtains to permit light into the chamber. "And you require care." "I require solitude," Henry said, but his voice suggested he did not actually believe this statement. Catherine ignored his objection. Instead, she moved to the side of the bed and examined him with the kind of attention typically reserved for important examination. His skin was hot, feverishly hot, and his breathing was visibly labored. His nightshirt was damp with perspiration. "You require clean nightclothes," she said, and before he could object, she was moving about the chamber with purposeful efficiency. She located fresh nightclothes, retrieved basin of water from the washing table, and began the process of assisting him to change. "This is not appropriate behavior for Duchess," he said, though he submitted to her assistance with the helplessness that fever creates. "Appropriate behavior is irrelevant when addressing medical necessity," Catherine replied. "I suggest you cease attempting to maintain dignity and simply permit me to assist you." She worked with careful attention, aware that every movement cost him effort. She changed his nightshirt. She used cool water and cloth to attempt reduction of fever, forehead, wrists, neck, where blood vessels ran close to skin. She arranged pillows to support his breathing, propping him at angle rather than permitting him to lie fully horizontal. "Water," she said, and he drank from cup she held to his lips. By evening, Henry's fever had intensified rather than improved. His skin retained the feverish flush, and his consciousness appeared to drift in and out of clear focus. Catherine remained in the chamber, sitting in chair beside the bed, maintaining vigil that the Dowager had apparently deemed acceptable. "You should leave," Henry said during one moment of relative lucidity. "You will exhaust yourself." "I will manage," Catherine replied simply. "You married man who is dying," he continued, and the fever lent his voice strange quality, simultaneously more honest and less controlled than his typical precise speech. "And now you are sitting beside his deathbed, as though you possess some capacity to prevent inevitable." "I am sitting beside your bed because you are suffering and require assistance," Catherine replied. "Whether or not I can prevent the inevitable is irrelevant to the present necessity." The fever lasted 4 days. During that time, Catherine did not leave the chamber except to bathe and change clothes. The Dowager, observing this devotion with expressions suggesting recalculation of assessment, ensured that meals were brought to the chamber and that supplies were available. By April 26th, fever had broken. Henry was considerably weakened. The fever had taken physical toll that extended beyond the illness itself, but the immediate crisis had passed. "You remained," he said, on morning when fever had finally abated enough that his mind had returned to full presence. His His voice was hoarse from days of difficult breathing. "Yes," Catherine confirmed. "Why?" he asked, and the question carried genuine confusion, as though concept of remaining beside dying man was incomprehensible to him. Catherine considered answer carefully. "Because you are my husband, because you required assistance, because remaining seemed appropriate." She did not say, "Because during those days sitting beside your bed, I discovered something that I was not anticipating when we married, that watching you suffer created feeling that extended beyond obligation or duty, that caring for you created meaning that transcends transaction of our marriage." But Henry, observing her face with the kind of attention that illness had sharpened, appeared to understand this without necessity of explicit statement. April 27th, evening. Henry had regained sufficient strength to sit in the drawing-room, though the dowager had insisted that he not exert himself beyond minimal requirement. He was seated by the window, watching spring light fade into approaching dusk, when Catherine joined him. "You experienced something during my fever," he said without preamble. "I observed it in your face. You altered your understanding of something." Catherine settled into chair beside him, unsurprised by his directness. Their conversations had been progressing toward increasing honesty as days passed. "Yes," she admitted, "I experienced alteration of understanding." "What understanding was altered?" he asked. "My understanding of what marriage is," Catherine replied. "I entered this arrangement believing it was transaction, that you required wife, that I required elevation of family circumstance and security, and all of those things remain true. But during your fever, I discovered that you are person, that your suffering creates response in me that transcends transaction." Henry was silent, and in his silence Catherine could observe him processing her admission. "I have spent considerable time determining why I married you," he said finally. "I married you from compassion. I married you from desire to provide you with circumstances that would permit you independence and security. And yes, I married you from desire to experience authentic human connection before I die." He turned to face her more fully, and the evening light caught his face at an angle that revealed the extent of illness, the thinness, the prominence of bone, the fevered brightness of eyes. "But what I did not anticipate," he continued, "was that you would transform marriage into something approaching genuine partnership, that you would sit beside me during fever, not from obligation, but from actual concern for my welfare, that you would discover capacity for care that I did not believe existed in anyone." "How can you know what I feel?" Catherine asked. "How can you determine that my care is genuine rather than simply good performance?" "Because," Henry replied, "authentic care manifests in small details, in way you attended to my comfort rather than your own during fever, in way you do not avoid touching me or looking at me, though my appearance is considerably changed by illness, in way you remain present rather than retreating to safety of minimal obligation." He extended his hand toward her, and Catherine found herself taking it without hesitation. "I am dying," he said quietly, "and I am aware that I am dying, but I am no longer dying alone. That is transformation of circumstance that I did not merit but have nonetheless received." Catherine did not attempt to formulate response to his statement. Instead, she simply held his hand as darkness settled over the drawing-room, and neither of them required additional words to communicate what had been articulated through actions and presence. April 29th, evening. Henry's fever had completely abated, though he remained substantially weakened. Dr. Ashby, visiting that afternoon, had confirmed that Henry's condition remained stable, which in context of consumption meant that decline was not accelerating, even if it was not reversible. Catherine was preparing for sleep when she discovered Henry in her chamber. He wore his dressing gown and moved with deliberateness that suggested purposeful action rather than casual entry. "Dr. Ashby has advised me that moderate physical exertion, when managed with care, is not contraindicated," he said, and there was slight tremor in his voice suggesting he was uncertain of his reception. "I have been contemplating since our marriage whether consummation of this union is something that you would permit." Catherine understood in that moment that Henry was offering her choice, that he was not demanding conjugal relations as right of husband, but proposing them as possibility that she could accept or decline. "Yes," she said simply. "What occurred was not rapid or passionate consummation. It was something considerably more tender and considerably more meaningful." Henry moved with extreme care, conscious of physical limitations that his illness created. Catherine discovered that she could be gentle without feeling diminished by gentleness, that physical connection could exist without demand for performance. He trembled occasionally, whether from exertion or emotion or fever residue she could not determine. His breathing required conscious attention, but none of these limitations prevented him from expressing through touch what words had only partially conveyed. "I am sorry that I am so limited," he said, his voice rough with emotion and physical effort. "You are not limited in ways that matter," Catherine replied, and she found herself speaking absolute truth rather than comforting falsehood. "You are present. You are willing to be vulnerable. You are choosing to share this with me despite your limitations." By the time they lay together in aftermath, Catherine understood that marriage had transcended obligation and entered realm of genuine partnership, that Henry had not simply married her for pragmatic reasons, but that he had chosen her, continued to choose her, despite knowledge of what their marriage would require of her. "Thank you," he said, and she knew he was expressing gratitude for more than physical intimacy. He was expressing gratitude for her presence, her choice, her willingness to remain. In the darkness, Catherine held her dying husband and understood that she had fallen in love with him, not despite his mortality, but perhaps partially because his mortality had stripped away possibility of pretense and forced them both toward authenticity. May 3rd, 1873. The Dowager Duchess had been observing Catherine with increasing attention since Henry's fever. She had observed the way that Catherine moved about the household with new quality of purpose. She had observed the way that Henry watched Catherine when he believed no one was observing him. She had observed the particular kind of intimacy that had developed between the Duke and his young bride. On morning of May 3rd, the Dowager requested that Catherine join her in her private sitting room. This was first private conversation that had occurred between them since Catherine's arrival. "I have been incorrect in my assessments regarding you," the Dowager said without preamble. She did not invite Catherine to sit, but stood by the window with posture suggesting internal conflict was being managed through rigid physical control. "Your Grace?" Catherine inquired. "When you arrived, I believed you were merchant's daughter, who had been married to my son for purposes of financial gain on behalf of your family and comfort-seeking on behalf of my son," the Dowager continued. "I believed that you would prove unsuitable, too young, too inexperienced, too committed to your own interests to manage the reality of what marriage to Henry entails." She turned to face Catherine directly. "I was wrong," she said. "I have observed you during past weeks. I have observed how you managed his fever, how you have demonstrated care that extends beyond obligation, how you have altered your entire existence to accommodate his limitations and his requirements." Catherine remained silent, uncertain what response was appropriate. "Henry is dying," the Dowager said, and her voice carried quality of steel. "I am aware of this because I have been his mother for 32 years. I have watched him grow from boy into man. I have watched this illness progress from theory into certainty, and I have resigned myself to the reality that my son will not have normal lifespan, that he will not have heirs of his body, that he will not have partnership of the traditional variety." She paused, and in her pause existed recognition of grief that extended far beyond what words could express. "But you have given him something that I could not give him," she continued. "You have given him partnership. You have given him reason to believe that dying alone is not inevitable outcome of his existence. You have given him gift of being known completely and being accepted anyway." The Dowager's hands trembled slightly, and Catherine understood that what appeared as coldness was actually manifestation of profound sorrow compressed into aristocratic control. "I am requesting that you permit me to know you better," the Dowager said. "I am requesting that you permit me to move beyond my position as critical observer and become something approaching genuine family. Henry has precious months remaining. I would prefer to spend those months as ally rather than as obstacle." Catherine found herself moving forward, and in gesture that would have been inconceivable weeks earlier, taking the Dowager's hand. "I would welcome that," she said simply. From that moment forward, the household dynamics shifted. The Dowager became advocate rather than skeptic. She ensured that Henry received optimal care. She facilitated Catherine's navigation of household and social expectations. And most importantly, she began to look at her son with expressions suggesting that she could see him, really see him, in ways that his illness had previously obscured. By May 5th, observers of the household would have noted that the Dowager Duchess had become considerably more animated in her interactions with her daughter-in-law, that she had begun to teach Catherine the protocols of managing aristocratic estate, that she had begun to speak of post-Henry future with Catherine, as though Catherine would have role to play in that future. The household staff, observing these changes, understood that the young Duchess had accomplished what seemed impossible. She had transformed the Dowager Duchess's coldness into genuine maternal affection. May 6, 1873. Thomas Edward Wellington, Duke's younger brother, arrived at Creston House without advance warning, which suggested something motivated his arrival with sufficient urgency that conventional courtesy could be dispensed with. He was considerably more physically robust than his brother. Where Henry was angular and diminished by illness, Thomas possessed the kind of physical solidity suggesting athletic training and consistent health. He possessed the same bone structure, the same fundamental handsomeness, but where Henry's appearance had been refined into intellectual intensity by suffering, Thomas's appearance retained quality of uncomplicated vitality. "Henry," Thomas said, encountering his brother in the library, "you appear considerably more diminished than correspondence suggested." "Thomas," Henry replied, with slight smile that suggested pleasure at his brother's arrival, despite unsentimental greeting, "your assessments have never possessed quality of diplomatic delicacy." Thomas turned to Catherine, who had entered behind him. She had been reading to Henry, and Thomas's arrival had necessitated interruption. "This must be the mysterious wife," Thomas said, and his expression suggested he was reassessing something about his understanding of his brother's circumstances. "I have been informed by approximately 17 different sources that you have transformed Henry's final months into something approaching happiness." "I have done nothing except remain present," Catherine replied. "Yes," Thomas agreed, studying her with intensity, suggesting he was conducting thorough assessment. "That is precisely what Henry required. Presence without judgment, acceptance without pity." He returned his attention to his brother. "I need to speak with you privately regarding financial matters related to your will and your estate, and I suspect regarding implications of Catherine's position as your widow." What occurred over subsequent hours was a series of conversations that Thomas conducted with Henry, with the solicitor who was summoned from town, and with Catherine herself. Thomas was apparently Henry's closest confidant regarding the reality of his condition. Indeed, as details emerged, it became clear that Thomas had been managing considerable portion of Henry's affairs as Henry's own capacity had diminished. "Henry has informed me that he has rewritten his will substantially," Thomas said to Catherine when they had occasion for private conversation. "His initial will, which he executed prior to your marriage, allocated the bulk of his estate to distant cousin who possesses neither interest nor capability of managing it properly. His revised will, which he has executed since your marriage, allocates the estate to you." Catherine felt her breath catch. "He has done what?" "Made you primary beneficiary of his considerable wealth," Thomas replied. "He has done so with full awareness that he is providing you with independence and security that will extend long beyond his death. He has done so with characteristic absence of sentimentality, but with absolute clarity regarding his intentions." "I did not marry him for financial gain," Catherine said, and the words came out with defensive quality that seemed to amuse Thomas. "I am aware," he replied. "Henry would not have married you if he believed otherwise. He married you because he perceived that you possessed capacity for genuine human connection, and he has ensured that your faithfulness to him during his final months would not result in your own destitution." Over the subsequent days, Thomas remained at Creston House, and Catherine had opportunity to observe the relationship between the brothers. It was complex, containing affection and the particular kind of honesty that existed between siblings who had witnessed each other's entire lives. Thomas was considerably less guarded than Henry, but he possessed the same fundamental integrity. On evening of May 8th, Catherine encountered Thomas in the library while Henry rested. "Thank you," she said without preamble. "For what?" Thomas asked. "For supporting his decision to marry me, for not objecting, for accepting that his motivations, however pragmatic they might appear, were also genuine." Thomas set down the volume he had been reading. "Henry is my brother. I have known him for 28 years, and I have observed him become increasingly isolated as his illness progressed, not because he was avoiding society, but because society was avoiding him. A dying man is a reminder of mortality that society prefers not to contemplate." He paused, and Catherine could observe emotion moving behind his expression. "I am grateful that he found someone willing to accompany him during his final months," Thomas continued. "I am grateful that his remaining time is not consumed entirely by solitude and pain, and I am grateful that someone as capable and as genuine as you chose to remain at his side despite knowing what remaining would entail. By the time Thomas departed 4 days later, something had shifted in his expression when he observed Catherine and Henry together. It was not precisely romantic observation, but it was observation of a man beginning to recognize a woman as a separate individual rather than simply as his brother's wife. Catherine did not initially recognize the significance of this shift in Thomas's attention. She was entirely occupied with the reality that Henry's condition, which had seemed temporarily stabilized by his fever's remission, was beginning a more consistent pattern of decline. The time they had was beginning to be measured not in months, but in weeks. May 15, 1873. The world did not announce its cruelty through dramatic gestures. Instead, it announced itself through accumulation of small deteriorations. Henry's breathing became slightly more labored each week. His appetite diminished in increments that were barely perceptible until they became impossible to ignore. His capacity to remain upright for extended periods decreased with consistency that suggested the disease was no longer moving gradually, but beginning to accelerate. Catherine observed these changes with the kind of attention that love creates, the ability to perceive minute shifts in circumstance and to understand their significance. She noticed that Henry required assistance ascending the stairs. She noticed that conversations that had previously sustained themselves for hours were now interrupted by need for rest. She noticed that his hands trembled more frequently, and that the tremor was no longer minor complication, but significant impediment. Dr. Ashby, visiting on May 15th, delivered assessment that no one required but everyone anticipated. "The disease is progressing more rapidly than initial prognosis suggested," he said, his clinical tone unable to completely mask concern. "I estimate that we are approaching significant deterioration. The next several weeks will likely determine whether His Grace has months remaining or whether timeline is considerably compressed." Henry received this information with the kind of calm that comes from having already accepted the worst possible outcome. Thomas, present for the examination, displayed considerably more visible emotional response, and Catherine simply took Henry's hand and did not release it. By May 20th, Henry no longer attempted to maintain normal household routines. He remained in his chambers, rising occasionally to sit by the window when strength permitted. His breathing had become audible, a kind of labored rasping that persisted through both day and night. Catherine had relocated her personal possessions to his chamber. She was no longer wife in conventional sense, but something approaching combination of companion, nurse, and witness. "You should not sacrifice your own health for my declining body," Henry said on evening of May 20th, when Catherine had just finished assisting him with simple task of changing his nightshirt. "My health is not being sacrificed," Catherine replied. "My attention is being directed toward what I believe matters most. There is distinction between those circumstances." "You are exhausted," Henry observed, studying her face with intensity, suggesting he was committing details to memory. "You are running yourself into collapse for man who will not be here to appreciate your devotion." "I am not doing this for appreciation," Catherine replied. "I am doing this because you matter, because your comfort matters, because your remaining time matters." By May 25th, household staff had begun to understand the reality that no one was explicitly stating. The Duke was dying, not in theoretical future sense, but in immediate, undeniable present sense. The question was no longer whether but when, and how much time remained. The Dowager Duchess, observing her son's decline with expression suggesting she was engaged in internal struggle with something beyond simple maternal grief, began to spend hours sitting in his chamber. She did not speak constantly. Sometimes she simply sat beside him in silence, occasionally holding his hand, occasionally adjusting his pillows or ensuring his comfort. On May 27th, Thomas approached Catherine in the corridor outside Henry's chamber. "You are destroying yourself," he said without preamble. "You have not slept more than an hour at a time for weeks. You have not eaten adequately. You are running yourself into illness that will make you incapable of caring for him." "I am managing," Catherine replied, though her voice suggested she was managing through force of will rather than genuine capacity. "You are not managing," Thomas said, and there was surprising gentleness in his contradiction. "You are simply persisting. There is difference. I'm requesting that you permit me to sit with Henry for several hours each night, to permit you to sleep. I am requesting this not as suggestion, but as requirement." Catherine understood in that moment that Thomas was offering her permission to rest. not through his words, but through his willingness to share the burden of vigil, that he recognized her need even though she had been attempting to ignore it. "Thank you," she said simply. June 2nd, 1873. The realization struck Catherine not as sudden epiphany, but as accumulated understanding that could no longer be denied. She was sitting beside Henry's bed during one of Thomas's rest periods, observing the rise and fall of his chest with each labored breath, and understanding cascaded through her with overwhelming clarity. She had fallen in love with man she was watching die. This had not been part of her understanding of marriage when she had entered it. She had expected duty. She had expected some version of companionship. She had expected that she would manage his illness with competence, and that she would accept his death with the kind of stoicism that society demanded of widows. What she had not anticipated was that love would make death unbearable. The love was not sudden or romantic in the conventional sense. It was love built through accumulated moments of vulnerability and authenticity. It was love constructed through her sitting beside his fever, through his allowing her to see his fear, through his demonstrating that he could be present with her despite his body's betrayal. It was love that had grown, not despite his mortality, but partially because his mortality had stripped away pretense and forced them both toward genuine connection. She sat beside him and felt grief so profound that it could not be expressed through tears or words. It was grief that existed as physical presence, a weight in her chest, a constriction in her throat, a hollow emptiness that seemed to expand as she contemplated the approaching reality. Henry opened his eyes, as though he perceived her emotional state through some sixth sense that illness had sharpened. "Catherine," he said, and his voice carried concern that transcended his own physical suffering. "What is occurring?" "I love you," she said, and the words came out not as declaration but as confession of something that could no longer be concealed. "I have attempted to maintain perspective. I have attempted to recognize this as temporary circumstance that I will survive, but I love you, and I cannot bear that you are dying." Henry was silent for extended period, and Catherine wondered if she had committed terrible error by articulating what should perhaps have remained unspoken. "Yes," he said finally, "I have been aware of this for weeks. I have observed it in manner in which you touch me, in manner in which you look at me when you believe I am not observing, in manner in which you have restructured your entire existence around my comfort." He reached toward her and she took his hand. "I am dying," he continued, his voice steady despite the gravity of his words, "and you are not. This is reality that we must both accept. What I am asking is that you not permit my death to become burden that you carry for remainder of your life. I am asking that you permit yourself to grieve, but then to live." "I do not know how to do that," Catherine said. "I am going to assist you," Henry replied. "I'm going to ensure that you possess resources, both emotional and financial, that will permit you to construct life that extends beyond the margins of my death." June 8, 1873. Henry had been progressively less capable of physical activity, but his mind remained acute. The disease was attacking his body, but it had not yet compromised his intellectual capacity or his will. On morning of June 8th, he requested that Catherine locate writing materials and position them on small table beside his bed, where he could access them despite his physical limitations. "I'm going to write," he said simply. "I'm going to write letters that you will read after my death. I'm going to create something that extends beyond my physical existence." Catherine positioned the materials and provided whatever assistance he required, and over subsequent days, Henry wrote. The effort was considerable. Each letter required multiple breaks as his labored breathing necessitated rest. His handwriting became progressively less steady as days advanced, but his words did not diminish in significance. He wrote letters addressing specific circumstances, letters to be read on Catherine's birthday, on their wedding anniversary, on Christmas morning. He wrote letters offering guidance regarding management of the estate. He wrote letters expressing gratitude toward household staff and family members. He wrote letters addressing questions he anticipated Catherine might encounter in years following his death. But most importantly, he wrote letters expressing what his marriage to Catherine had meant. He wrote of his initial intention, compassionate marriage that would provide her with security and independence. He wrote of his inability to anticipate the manner in which Catherine would transform his final months. He wrote of his discovery that dying with genuine companion was experience entirely different from dying in isolation. "You have given me gift of being known," one letter read, in Henry's increasingly uncertain handwriting. "You have permitted me to be vulnerable. to express fear, to demonstrate weakness without requirement that I maintain facade of ducal dignity. You have given me most precious gift that one human being can offer another. You have witnessed my authentic self and accepted it completely." Catherine read these letters as they were written, tears streaming down her face, understanding that Henry was creating permanence against mortality, that he was ensuring that she would possess his words after his voice was silenced, that he was using the only tool available to him, written words, to create continuation of their conversation beyond the limits of his lifespan. By June 15th, Henry had completed the letters. They were assembled and organized with clear instructions regarding when each should be read. He had also begun to deteriorate visibly. His breathing had become more labored, his appetite nearly non-existent, his capacity for consciousness diminishing with each passing day. "It is sufficient," he said to Catherine when she brought the final collection of letters to him. "I have said what required saying. I have ensured that you will possess my words when you need them. That is legacy that I can provide." June 18th through July 2nd, 1873. For a brief period, approximately 2 weeks, Henry experienced what appeared to be stabilization. His breathing, while still labored, seemed to require slightly less effort. His appetite improved marginally. He possessed sufficient energy to sit in chair by the window for extended periods, observing the garden as it progressed through peak of summer bloom. During this period, careful hope began to establish itself throughout the household. Perhaps individuals began to think the disease was not progressing quite so rapidly as feared. Perhaps Henry would survive through summer. Perhaps the trajectory of decline could be arrested. Even Catherine, despite her attempts to maintain realistic perspective, felt hope beginning to encroach. She found herself thinking not about Henry's death, but about Henry's recovery. She found herself imagining future conversations, future moments of partnership, future possibilities that required him to continue existing. On June 25th, Thomas drew her aside. "Do not permit false hope to establish itself," he said quietly. "I have observed this pattern before in terminal illness. The body occasionally experiences period of seeming stabilization. It is not recovery. It is not reprieve. It is simply temporary cessation of immediate decline." "How can you know this with such certainty?" Catherine asked. "Because I have watched people die before," Thomas replied, "and I have observed the patterns that precede death. This stabilization, it is not positive indicator. It is often final expenditure of the body's remaining reserves before collapse becomes complete." Catherine wanted to reject his assessment. She wanted to believe that hope was justified. But she also possessed enough honesty to recognize that Thomas was speaking from observation rather than pessimism. On July 2nd, Henry's breathing became suddenly and dramatically worse. The stabilization that had offered false reassurance collapsed entirely. What had been labored breathing transformed into desperate gasping. What had been managed decline became acute crisis. Dr. Ashby was summoned. He administered medication for pain and medication for breathing, but his expression communicated what his words did not explicitly state. The end was approaching with rapid acceleration. "Hours," he said quietly to Catherine and Thomas when they joined him outside Henry's chamber. "Perhaps a day, perhaps slightly longer, but not more than that. The body is failing. The reserves that permitted the stabilization have been exhausted." Catherine felt as though the floor had tilted beneath her. She had known that Henry was dying, but she had unconsciously permitted herself to believe that there would be slightly more time, that there would be slightly more opportunity for words, for touch, for presence. The remaining time was being measured not in weeks but in hours. July 2nd through July 4th, 1873. Henry remained conscious, though the effort that consciousness required was visible in every line of his body. He slipped occasionally into states of semi-lucidity, but he would emerge from these states and return to awareness when Catherine or his family required his presence. On evening of July 2nd, when the household had grown quiet and it was simply Catherine and Henry in the darkness of his chamber, he reached for her hand with grip that was barely substantial but conveyed desperate intention. "Promise me something," he said, his voice so quiet that she had to lean close to perceive his words. "Anything," she replied. "Promise me that you will not permit my death to define the remainder of your life. Promise me that you will grieve, and then you will permit yourself to live, that you will not become widow consumed entirely by memory of marriage that lasted 8 months." "How can I make such promise?" Catherine asked, tears streaming down her face. "By understanding that honoring my death is not same as ceasing to live," Henry replied. by understanding that continuing to exist fully is manner in which you honor what we shared, by understanding that I do not require that you remain frozen in moment of my death. On morning of July 3rd, the Dowager Duchess spent extended time alone with her son. What transpired in that chamber remained private, but when she emerged, her face was transformed, not with peace exactly, but with something approaching resolution, with acceptance that transcended resignation. "He is ready," she said to Catherine simply. "He has accomplished what he required. He has ensured that his affairs are in order. He has ensured that you are provided for. He is ready to permit his body to complete the process of dying." On evening of July 3rd, Thomas sat with Henry while Catherine rested. When she returned to the chamber near midnight, Henry was sleeping or something approximating sleep, his breathing interrupted by occasional gasps and the kind of involuntary movements that the body produces when it is failing. "He has not spoken for several hours," Thomas reported, "but he has squeezed my hand occasionally, which suggests he remains aware on some level." Catherine settled into the chair beside Henry's bed. She did not remove her hand from his. She did not permit distance to establish itself between them. On morning of July 4th, 1873, Henry's breathing became so shallow as to be barely perceptible. His eyes remained closed. His hand, which Catherine still held, was cool but not yet cold. Catherine sat beside him and understood that she was witnessing the final hours of the man she had married 8 months earlier. "Thank you," she whispered, though she was uncertain whether he could hear her. "Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for permitting me to know you. Thank you for loving me despite knowing you would die." At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, his breathing stopped, not dramatically, not with final gasping, but simply ceased, as though his body had finally completed the task that illness had imposed upon it. Henry Wellington, Duke of Creston, was dead. Catherine held his hand for extended period afterward, not releasing it, not accepting the reality that the hand she held was now simply hand of corpse rather than hand of man she had come to love with complete authenticity. The Dowager, entering the chamber and observing her daughter-in-law's grief, did not attempt to separate them. Instead, she simply stood witness to the moment, matriarch observing the conclusion of marriage that had transformed her understanding of her son and of what love could accomplish. Outside the chamber, household staff began the process of managing death, sending for the physician to confirm, sending for the solicitor to initiate legal procedures, beginning the logistics of preparing body for funeral, and managing the affairs of suddenly widowed wife who was not yet 19 years old. Catherine remained in the chamber with her dead husband and understood that her life had fundamentally divided into 2 parts, before this moment and everything that would come after. July 7th, 1873. The funeral service was conducted at the parish church nearest Creston House, and it was attended by individuals representing every stratum of society that Henry had encountered during his lifetime. Nobility arrived in carriages bearing crests. Merchants and professionals attended, representing the various connections Henry had maintained through business and stewardship of his estate. Estate workers and tenants occupied rear pews, their attendance representing respect for man who had managed their livelihoods. Catherine sat in the front pew, dressed entirely in black silk, black mourning jewelry, black veil that obscured her face while permitting observation of those around her. At her side was the Dowager Duchess, whose composure was so complete that she appeared carved from marble. Behind them sat Thomas, whose expression communicated barely contained grief that he was managing through rigid physical control. The service was conducted by the vicar, who had known Henry since Henry's childhood. The words were appropriate, references to Henry's stewardship, his generosity toward the parish, his commitment to his family and responsibilities. But what struck Catherine was the absence of specificity. The vicar could not articulate what Henry had truly been, because Henry's authentic self had been revealed only to those closest to him. The coffin was mahogany, simple but of excellent quality. As the pallbearers, selected from Henry's family, his oldest friends and representatives of the estate, moved it down the aisle, Catherine forced herself to remain motionless. She permitted no outward display of the internal destruction occurring. She simply sat with hands folded in her lap, observing the end of the man she had married. At the cemetery, in ground that held generations of Wellingtons, Henry was interred. Catherine threw the first handful of earth onto the coffin, and only then, only in that single moment, did her composure fracture. Her hand trembled, her breath hitched. But she recovered almost immediately, her innate dignity reasserting itself, her role as widow demanding that she demonstrate capability even as grief was attempting to annihilate her. By evening, the house was full of people offering condolences. Catherine received them all. Relatives of Henry, friends of the family, business associates, political connections. She thanked them for attending. She accepted their words of sympathy. She performed the role of widow with precision that would have seemed inhuman if observers had possessed capacity to perceive its cost. It was only after midnight, when the dowager had retired and the household had finally quieted, that Thomas found Catherine in the library, sitting in darkness beside the dying embers of the fire. "You should rest," he said quietly. "I cannot," Catherine replied. "I am afraid that if I sleep, I will forget the sound of his voice. I will forget precise shade of his eyes. I will forget the manner in which he held my hand during his final hours." Thomas sat in the chair across from her, maintaining respectful distance while communicating through his presence that she was not entirely alone. "Grief is exhausting," he said. "You are running yourself into collapse for second time. You did not permit yourself to collapse when he was alive because he required your care. Now you are attempting to collapse through force of will, which is equally destructive." "I have survived 18 years of life," Catherine said, and her voice carried quality of someone making statement that extended beyond literal meaning. 3 months of marriage, and now I am widow in household that is not truly my home, managing property I do not understand, facing future that consists entirely of uncertainty." "You are managing considerably more than that," Thomas replied. "You are managing grief. You are managing legal complications. You are managing the expectations of society regarding what widow should be. You are managing the reality that you are considerably younger and considerably richer than convention suggests you should be at this juncture in your life." He leaned forward slightly. "But I am requesting that you also permit yourself to be simply woman who is grieving," he continued. "I am requesting that you permit yourself to rest. I am requesting that you permit others to assist you in bearing weight that you are attempting to carry entirely alone." Catherine permitted silence to extend between them before responding. "He wrote letters," she said finally. "He wrote letters to be read after his death. I am terrified of reading them. I am terrified that reading his words will make his absence more complete rather than less complete." "Perhaps," Thomas suggested quietly, "reading his words is precisely what you require in order to continue existing. Perhaps his letters are his continuation. Perhaps his voice, preserved in written form, is manner in which he remains present." July 4th, 1875. Catherine Beatrice Wellington, Dowager Duchess of Creston, stood in the garden of her own country estate, acquired 6 months after Henry's death, and observed her son playing beneath the shade of ancient oak trees. James Wellington had been born 6 weeks after his father's death, and his existence was Henry's most substantial legacy. Dark hair that had belonged to his father, eyes that held promise of becoming equally penetrating, and a temperament that suggested he had inherited his father's fundamental decency, along with his genetic material. Catherine was no longer the girl who had been married at 18. She was woman of 20, independent in ways that society had not anticipated and could not quite comprehend. Henry's will had provided her with considerable financial resources, the estate, investments, and income streams that ensured she would never again be dependent upon family or circumstance. She had utilized these resources to establish small educational academy for daughters of merchants and professionals, an institution that reflected Henry's understanding that education was foundation of independence. "Your Grace," the housekeeper said, interrupting Catherine's observation of her son, "the Earl of Wellington has arrived and is requesting audience." Thomas had been arriving with increasing frequency over past months. He had assisted Catherine in managing the Creston estate. He had provided counsel regarding her educational ventures. He had become, in quiet and unmistakable way, something approaching necessary presence in her life. Catherine rose from the bench where she had been sitting and moved toward the house, conscious that her manner of walking, her bearing, had changed in 2 years. She moved now with confidence that had not existed before. She moved as woman who had survived loss and discovered that survival was possible. Thomas was waiting in the drawing room, and when Catherine entered, she observed him rise with expression that suggested he had been waiting not simply for this moment, but for some indefinite period, comprising multiple moments that had accumulated into significance. "I have been informed that you are planning expansion of your educational academy," he said without preamble. "I am requesting to become financial partner in this expansion." I am also requesting to become something considerably more than friend and advisor in your life, if you would permit such arrangement." Catherine remained very still, understanding that Thomas was articulating something that had been emerging gradually across months of interactions. "You are aware that I remain grieving," she said carefully. "Yes," Thomas agreed. "You remain grieving. You will likely remain grieving for considerable period. But you have also transformed yourself from girl into woman. You have established independence. You have created life that extends beyond margins of Henry's death. And I have become aware, through process of knowing you across these months, that I possess feelings for you that extend beyond friendship." He paused, and Catherine could observe emotion moving behind his expression. "I am not requesting that you respond immediately," he continued. "I am requesting only that you permit possibility of future partnership to establish itself in your consciousness. I am requesting that you understand that loving you is not betrayal of Henry, but rather continuation of what Henry initiated, genuine partnership between two individuals who see each other completely." Catherine turned toward the window, observing her son playing beneath the oak trees, living manifestation of her marriage to Henry, reminder that Henry's existence had created permanent alteration in her life and in the world. "I require time," she said finally. "I possess time," Thomas replied. "I am requesting only that you not dismiss possibility entirely, that you permit yourself to consider future that extends beyond grief and into something approaching happiness." By evening, Catherine had retreated to her private chambers, and she retrieved the collection of Henry's letters that she maintained in locked box beside her bed. She selected the letter marked, "To be read on the 2nd anniversary of my death." She opened it with trembling hands and read Henry's words, written months before his death, from man who had understood with remarkable clarity what would be required of her in the years following his departure. "My dearest Catherine, if you are reading this letter, 2 years have passed since my death. You have survived those years, which suggests you have accomplished considerably more than simple survival. You have likely established independence. You have likely discovered capacity within yourself that you did not anticipate. You have likely begun to contemplate future that extends beyond grief. I want you to understand something with absolute clarity. My death was not conclusion of your life. It was transformation of one chapter into another. And if you have encountered someone who offers partnership that extends beyond memory and into living present, I would request that you permit yourself to consider that possibility. I loved you. I continue to love you, though my love is now expressed through absence rather than presence. And because I love you, I want you to possess future that contains happiness and partnership and genuine human connection. Do not permit my memory to become prison in which you confine yourself. Live, Catherine. Live fully. Live authentically. Live in manner that honors not my death, but my hope for your continued existence." With love that transcends mortality, Henry Catherine held the letter and understood that her husband, dead for 2 years, was granting her permission to live. That his final gift was liberation from requirement to remain defined by their abbreviated marriage. That he was requesting from beyond death that she permit herself to become complete woman rather than remaining forever widow. She descended the stairs and found Thomas in the library, where he had been waiting through evening hours. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to what?" he asked, though his expression suggested he understood her meaning completely. "Yes to possibility," Catherine replied. "Yes to partnership. Yes to permitting future to develop without requirement that I remain imprisoned in past. Henry gave me permission. Now I am granting it to myself." Thomas crossed the distance between them and took her hand, not with the desperate intensity of dying man attempting to compress lifetime into final moments, but with the quiet confidence of man who understood that they possessed time. That future extended before them without predetermined endpoint. "Thank you," he said, and Catherine understood that he was expressing gratitude for more than her acceptance of his proposal. He was expressing gratitude for her willingness to continue living fully, for her courage in permitting herself to love again, for her capacity to honor what Henry had offered while simultaneously moving forward into new possibility. In the darkness of the library, with portrait of Henry on the wall observing the moment with painted eyes that contained Henry's characteristic combination of sadness and hope, Catherine began the process of becoming not widow, but woman who had been widow and survived into something more complex and more genuine than either grief or happiness alone could capture. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the heart of Victorian England, a story of love, loss and the transformative power of genuine human connection. We shared the brief but profound marriage of Catherine and Henry, two souls who discovered authenticity in the shadow of mortality. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to share your experience with us. Please leave a comment below and tell us which moment moved you most deeply. Was it Catherine's devotion during Henry's fever, Henry's final letters to his beloved, the tender moments of genuine partnership despite illness? Your words help us understand which stories resonate most deeply with your hearts. Please subscribe to our channel Victorian Romance Audio Stories so you never miss our upcoming tales of love, loss, healing, and second chances. Each story we share is crafted with intention to remind you that love transcends even the cruelest circumstances, that authenticity and genuine partnership are possible even in abbreviated timeframes. Share this story with someone you know who believes in the transformative power of love. Share it with those who understand that mortality makes meaning precious, not futile. This is not the end. This is simply the conclusion of one chapter in the vast library of human love. New stories await, stories of redemption, of second chances, of women and men discovering that life's greatest gifts are often found in unexpected places and unexpected people. Thank you for your presence. Thank you for your hearts. We will see you in our next story.